Glad to be joining the first India-Australia virtual summit with you, Prime Minister Scott Morrison. India-Australia ties have always been close. As vibrant democracies from the Commonwealth to cricket to in cuisine, our people-to-people relations are strong and the future is bright. This is not me, this is the tweet by Prime Minister Narendra Modi on 4 June 2020, which sums up the current state of relationship between Australia and India. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, namaskar, kem cho, sat sri akal, salam alaikum, vadakkam, depending on what part of the world of the globe you are attending this event from. My name is Ashutosh Misra, and I am the CEO of the Institute for Australia-India Engagement. Your Excellencies, Mr. Barry O'Farrell, Australian High Commissioner to India, Sri GITESH Sharma, Indian High Commissioner to Australia, Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, author of the Australia Economic Strategy, and former Secretary East, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, Mr. Peter Varghese, AO, Chancellor of the University of Queensland, former Secretary DFAT and High Commissioner to India, and also the author of the India Strategy. Former Foreign Minister, Mr. Stephen Smith, former Premier of Victoria, Mr. Ted Bellew, Ambassador Amit Dasgupta, Mr. Tony Huber, former Consul General to Mumbai, Honorary Consul, Queensland, Srimati Archana Singh, analysts and officials from Australian and Indian governments and academic institutions, business organizations, community leaders, representatives, my colleagues from IAIE, India News, and our wonderful co-hosts, Mr. Shaun Star, the director of the Center for India-Australia Studies at the Jindal Global University, Ms. Sanushka Seomangal, the National Vice Chair for the Australia-India Business Council, and a large number of students who have registered from Australia and India, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from where we host this dialogue, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. It is a blooming delight and pleasure to welcome you all to the inaugural Triveni Dialogue of 2021 to kickstart our intellectual, academic, and policy journey. And we could not have hoped for a better lineup for what promises to be a highly policy relevant, timely, and stimulating dialogue. We are very thankful to our eminent speakers who have been very instrumental in shaping the course of their respective foreign policies, and then specifically in the context of Australia-India relations. Since early 2000, the number of prime ministers, foreign ministers, diplomats, scholars, business leaders, sportspersons, entrepreneurs, educationists on both sides have played an invaluable role in enriching bilateral ties in multiple fields. And it was in this context that first, after the elevation of ties into a strategic partnership in 2009 between Prime Minister Kevin Rudd and Manmohan Singh, which has now been elevated into a comprehensive strategic partnership in June 2020 during the virtual summit, demonstrates that, as His Excellency Barry O'Farrell said in one of his lectures in New Delhi, and I quote, "India and Australia have grown closer together and are at a historical high," unquote. We must see the release of the two comprehensive economic strategies, for me, the Magna Carta of bilateral engagements, to comprehend the gravity and importance of strategic opportunity that lay before us in the wake of COVID-19 battering and rapidly altering international geopolitics, especially in the Indo-Pacific. I recall His Excellency GITESH Sharma in one of his recent speeches very aptly remarked, and I quote, "India is the flavor of the season for Australians who want to do serious business with India." And you would agree that this conducive season or historic high in bilateral ties has been ripened by the two economic strategies produced by Mr. Peter Varghese and Ambassador Anil Wadhwa. If Ambassador Anil Wadhwa observed, and I quote, "The altered regional and global politics presents excellent prospects for enhancement of bilateral economic ties," unquote, Mr. Varghese wrote in his report, "Australian government have neither the capacity nor the inclination to direct business, particularly agencies such as DFAT and Austrade have an important role in helping Australian firms understand the complexities of the Indian marketplace and India's business culture, including how to find the right partner and understanding the broader political economy of India." It is in this context that the events such as the Triveni Dialogue become instrumental in complementing the objectives of the comprehensive strategic partnership, which is now being steered under the framework laid down by the two strategies. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, before I invite my co-host, Sanushka Seomangal, I quickly want to flag that the Triveni Dialogue, envisaged by the IAIE, takes its name after Triveni, the tri-junction of three rivers, the Ganges, Jamuna, and Saraswati at Prayagraj in India. We have partnered with Center for India-Australia Studies at the Jindal Global University and AIBC to constitute the Triveni dialogue and make the three rivers of this trilateral dialogue and organize policy dialogues periodically. In 2020, we had organized dialogues on sport, diplomacy, and Modi-Morrison virtual summit. Ladies and gentlemen, IAIE, which was launched in 2018 to complement the objectives of the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, has a motto and which says, the deeper we understand each other, the better we engage. This is the core objective of the Triveni Dialogue series. For the record, this dialogue is being streamed to thousands of our viewers and subscribers on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks to India News, our media partner. And we look forward to a presentation today and understand what's next now that the two strategies are in place. With these words, I now invite my colleague, Sanushka Seomangal, the National Vice Chair for Australia India Business Council, and our moderator for the dialogue to kick start the proceedings. Thank you very, very much. Sanushka, all yours.
Thank you, Ashutosh. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We're very excited to be part of this session. I think we've all become old friends, having gone through first the economic strategy to India and then the response by Ambassador Wadhwa and the various discussions and contributions that each of us, I think, has at least tried to make to this process and to this outcome. So we're very excited today, and particularly because today we're going to hear from both the authors and the champions. And now that we've all had the opportunity to celebrate and digest each of the reports, I think it's the time's now called to action. At the Australian India Business Council, we have our own ideas about how we can take those reports and their recommendations into action. We certainly have been attempting to do so through our various industry chapters and events that we've coordinated in that respect, through our digital exchange forum, and then through pursuing and leveraging existing partnerships with the likes of the Confederation of Indian Industry and FICCI, amongst others on the Indians, and then pursuing new relationships or relationships that we haven't yet properly had the opportunities to cement, but are certainly attempting to do so at this opportune time with the Business Council of Australia and the Export Council of Australia. But we're keen, of course, as I'm sure as everybody else on this webinar, to hear from the authors and the champions about what comes next. What happens next? How can we take what we've seen, what we've heard, what you guys have recommended, and as tools in this relationship, how we can take that and move this forward. So without further ado, I'm going to call on Ambassador Wadhwa to kick it off. So Anil, over to you.
Anushka, thank you very much for that introduction, and it's a great honor to be present here along with the two High Commissioners and as well as Peter Varghese and everyone else who's going to speak today. Thank you, Dr. Ashutosh, for the invitation. I think what I'll do is I will look at, not the report as such, because that's all before you all, but the particular opportunities that have arisen and, what has changed since the report was written, and the opportunities that changed situation also presents. And then I'll talk a little bit about the implementation part, because the report itself has got a whole section on implementation. We'd like to pick out some of those suggestions which are very, very necessary at this point in time going forward. So as we all know, this report, the India's Australia Economic Strategy Report, was released on the 18th of November in 2020, which happened in the virtual presence of Ministers Piyush Goyal and Sam in Birmingham, before he changed portfolios, and a large number of stakeholders in the Australia-India relationship. Now, of course, the report has 12 key sectors and also 10 emerging sectors. But what is important is that this report stresses that Australia should not be judged in India by the current size of its market, or the fact that it is a difficult place to reach, because that was a sort of misnomer and a myth which many people had in their minds. You just look at the growing tourism and business links and the strength of the Indian students in Australia, which reached 120,000 just before the pandemic, as well as the 750,000 diaspora from India and Australia. That's all disproved these myths. And the report has brought out the fact that Australia is, in fact, an ideal strategic partner for India in its journey to achieve what we need a transformative and inclusive economic growth. Because India needs to achieve this growth while also dealing with challenges of a very large and growing population, especially in the areas of urban development, infrastructure, and water scarcity. And Australia faces similar challenges in some ways, and it is the complementarity of the resources available and the approach in dealing with these challenges that makes Australia the ideal partner, right partner for India to collaborate with. So the report actually sees Australia as a strategic partner for resource security agenda, as well as a technology for its technology upgradation plans. Now, what the report does is throws up a lot of opportunities for both sides, and what we try to do is to highlight these through chapters, but at the same time, first let's look at the opportunities for the Indian businesses in broad sectors of investments in mining and resources, in agribusiness, and also utilizing the best practices in Australian healthcare, in cancer research and trials, and then also collaborating in India in for India-specific solutions to education and skills development, offering Indian products in niche areas of information technology, and then, of course, opportunities in other sectors. That includes renewable energy, in tourism, in financial services, some creative fields like digital technologies, animation, and gaming, and looking for collaborations in infrastructure, which we haven't collaborated across in Australia so far, in joint manufacturing in space and defense, which is also something which has come up as a new subject. So if you look at businesses on both sides, I think there are opportunities across emerging areas like lithium-ion battery technology, of course, and then the medical and water technologies in data analysis and cloud computing, education and medical technologies, which will definitely have a bigger relevance in the future as both countries look to expand in these areas. Now, specifically, Indian businesses, I believe, were looking, but they will look more for offtake agreements with Australian resource companies going forward. So that includes mining technologies, which helps in the maximization of produce, of sourcing of mining equipment and technology, and also providing high quality product-based IT offerings for Australia, for the Australian market. And also there is scope for collaboration much more in financial and cyber technologies, and enhancing the startup collaborations. Now, of course, in the traditional areas, Indian companies will look for selling more of their pharmaceuticals or biosimilars, you may call them, and then Indian traditional medicine, which is catching up in the Australian market. But there is a huge scope for scaling up of Australian medical technologies in India, which we discovered while interviewing a number of hospitals, for instance, in Bangalore and Chennai and other places. Also, collaborations in medical data coding and analysis, which is very negligible right now in India, and it's a big market. They will also look to enhance the traditional Indian exports in gems and jewelry, in automotive spare parts, in railway equipment, in refined petroleum products, textiles, and also ready-to-eat Indian products, which is also a market which is catching up pretty fast. But what I would like to see in future, and is that Indian companies start investing in Australia in agribusiness and farms, as well as some EPC projects in renewables and solar farms, for example, just to name a few. So if businesses and governments put their efforts together, the report actually, says that India has the potential to increase its exports in goods as well as in services. And that figure we put down as 15, from 5 billion in 2018 to 5 billion in 15 billion in 2025, and then on to 35 billion in 2035. Of course, there are a lot of things which need to be done and a lot of efforts which have to be made, as I said, on the way to realizing this. Now, since the outset of the pandemic, we've seen how global value chains have been disrupted. And as far as India is concerned, and also Australia to a large extent, the over dependence on China has come to the fore. India has been in confrontation with China with heavy deployments now on the line of actual control for the past 11 months. And Australia has also faced some aggressive and coercive Chinese actions on the trade front. So Prime Minister Modi here in India has stressed on the concept of self-reliant India. And the pandemic has resulted in a number of reforms which should be noted going forward in the bilateral relationship between India and Australia. So that covers areas like mining, healthcare and agriculture, power, in defense and space, electronics and textile sectors. And new funds have been announced as well, in particular the one for healthcare and the startup sector, which is very significant, which happened just last week. So the definition of medium and small enterprises has been revised, and a relief package for these industries has also been announced. And I'm sure more reforms will follow. We're looking very closely with great interest to the budget, which is being announced today, starting in a few minutes, in 15 minutes, in fact, which will definitely, I think, highlight these areas of reform. And also, India has been focusing a lot on simplifying the difficulties faced in things like land acquisition and labor law reform and liquidity in order to attract some new investments. Ashutosh mentioned this, and I've said it many times before about the changed geopolitical scenario. And definitely, I'll repeat that again, that gives us a lot of scope for enhancing our economic ties between India and Australia in some very, very critical areas. What has happened there is that this has drawn attention to the need to rely on trustworthy partners who believe in the rule of law. And one of the offshoots of this was the fact that the ministers Piyush Goyal and Simon Birmingham, along with their Japanese counterpart, announced the Resilient Supply Chains Initiative, which happened on the 1st of September. I would really like to see something more happening in that field, something practical. And in India, we've seen that incentives have been announced for a boost to manufacturing, because the corporate tax has come down to below 25%. And also India has rolled out a production-linked incentive scheme and also a phased manufacturing plan. So the PLI scheme had actually already been started for electronics and for active pharmaceutical ingredients earlier. But it's been extended to 10 more sectors, and that includes things like battery manufacturing, auto components, network products, textiles, food processing, photovoltaic cells, etc. And now genomics and artificial intelligence and 5G, robotics, drones, they're all on the radar. So overall, actually, government has identified 24 focus sectors here in India as part of the local manufacturing effort, where I believe Australian companies can look for collaborations. They're ideally placed to do so with their Indian counterparts. We've had an Australia-India agreement on cooperation on critical minerals and rare earths. I think that is especially relevant because the two countries have great complementarity of interest there. While Australia is keen to find alternate export markets for its minerals, India also needs rare earths to bolster its advanced manufacturing sector, and more importantly, for the e-mobility program. Then again, we have the new mining policy, which will renew the scope for diversification, for expansion of the existing resources partnership in critical and strategic minerals. I keep saying this, and this is also in the report, that there are 400 million Indian youth who need to be trained by 2022. That's the target. Australia's vocational institutions have a continued opportunity in training curriculum, in aligning Indian accreditation and assessment to global standards, and also improving trainer quality, provided, of course, the scale and the costing goal is met. And this is a very peculiar requirement in the Indian market. So we've not been able to sort of cross that barrier so far. We're trying both sides are trying very hard, but that's not really happened because the opportunity is much bigger than what has been taken advantage of. Opportunities for sustainable solutions for water and water recycling in states across India, and of course in immunology and development of vaccines now, in the circular economy, in surface coal gasification, and waste to wealth processes. That opens up some new avenues also for the Indian companies. I think Australia is also superbly placed for helping India in grains management, in the rationalization of costs of logistics, because of the ongoing bilateral programs that we have in agriculture. They've been very successful and very focused. Also, the Australian super funds and infrastructure companies have already been involved in India for a long time, Macquarie, for instance, but now no doubt they will look to increase their presence on the highways and toll road sector, which is going to receive, I believe, a very big boost in the budget of today. And already the focus has been there in the sector in India. Then the defense and space related companies, as well as shipyards in India, on their part, I must say, have made special efforts to identify some new opportunities with Australia. But in my view, these need considerable efforts at the government level, not just the company level, because many of them are public sector undertakings. So to translate them into concrete collaborations, we require that government push. And I hope the two high commissioners are here, that they will do their best in that regard. Now, Australia has announced some very large investments in cyber security in Australia. India has a complementary pool to supply those requirements, and the Indo-Australian scientific collaboration in research and development, and also manufacturing equipment and identifying treatments to face global health emergencies have expanded now. Australian investments in technology have also been identified for collaborations in food technology and processing, a very important sector, and also the dairy sector. Now, 100% FDI, by the way, is now permitted in India for renewable energy generation and distribution projects, which again provides an opportunity for Australian companies. There is a requirement to set up pumped storage projects in India to manage large-scale integration of renewable sources of energy and grid balancing. And Australia has got a lot of experience in this regard. So Australian companies, again, should look for collaborations in that area. Now, we keep talking about tourism. Of course, the scope is there for in the areas of heritage and religious tourism, eco and coastal tourism, etc. But that opportunity will have to wait till the pandemic eases up. We cannot expect anything drastic to happen before that. But just the fact that one should not forget that this is a mega opportunity for the future. In e-learning solutions and also improving the existing curricula enabling teachers, for example, to develop online curricula. I think Australian businesses will benefit immensely from opportunities and market that India offers for scaling up these technologies. Also in medical technologies, for instance, in health technologies, in terms of technologies which are new and emerging, all of these have great scope. And I think if Australian and Indian companies can get together on collaborations on digital gaming and animation, in textile designing, in sports technologies and equipment, and also in clinical trials and healthcare, there is a big scope there for future collaboration. Now, in practical terms, as I said, a number of follow-up steps are very, very important in the future. And as I said, the report actually has a whole section on implementation strategies. But what is most important is that the first few months and the first year were under the direction and the supervision of the two ministers of commerce and industry and trade. I think both sides would need to form a special working group, which is composed of officials from not just their ministry concerned, which is the trade ministry, and also foreign ministry. In case of Australia, it will be the DFAT, and any other ministry or organization, which includes business if they deem fit. We should review the implementation of these two reports on a 6 monthly basis. That is the recommendation. And this will allow for discussion on removing trade and investment barriers, which have been identified also in the report, for facilitating businesses and engaging with each other, which cut across federal and state levels and also across different ministries. This will also involve, I believe, looking at issues which can ease, the business ties between the two countries, the consular-related issues, the taxation, the banking issues, the phytosanitary, and any other regulatory barrier. So I think the group might have to be further subdivided into subgroups, reporting to the two ministers again on a 6 monthly basis. But I think it's important that we must have this going as quickly as we can. And here I would look to the two high commissioners to take this forward. Second issue is about the departments concerned who are in charge of taking these reports, policies forward. I think they have to keep up their commitment a little bit till businesses can take over, because ultimately it's the businesses come to that. But they must remain supportive of this effort. So that will require setting aside some funds, obviously, which will allow for dissemination of information, and also making sure that the contents of the report are reports in this case would be well known to anyone who wants to take advantage. In fact, the Australia Economic Strategy Report contains several pointed recommendations. Now, these will need to be recommended by various ministries in India, and they will have to take action on themselves, take it upon themselves to implement them. The fact that there was a very elaborate consultative process before the report was finalized, in India at least, would help in that respect, because they've all agreed to, in fact, some of these are their suggestions. So it's not as if something which is new, they know about it, and they made amendments to, their own suggestions later. So I think they should be willing to run with it later, and knowing fully well that they will benefit in the long term with its implementation. Again, the coordination work is very important. That process needs to start. On the Indian side, it is two ministries who are involved. Australian side, there's probably one ministry, which is the lead ministry overall. But no one can do this themselves. They will require collaboration with different departments. The third issue, which has been highlighted also in the report, is about the free trade agreement negotiations. Now, India is not there in RCEP, and that's something which is, in my opinion, actually led to the stalling of the bilateral process between India and Australia, because it was put on the back burner thinking that both countries are going to join the RCEP at some stage, and so why bother talking about something which is going to be subsumed under that umbrella? But actually, not that. I think there are clear gains for both countries, which have been highlighted in the report. And there are many areas where if duty tariffs are brought down, I think both countries are going to gain. So we should actually align this to these interests, and this will also help, in my view, in the initiative with Japan in the Resilient Supply Chains Initiative. It's like, before you actually implement that, you actually also have to look at rules of origin and things like that, the tariff rates and dispute settlement mechanisms. So, I think that process should be started, in my view, as quickly as we can. Um, Fourth issue is about big businesses, because we've had uh, not much interest in the major business houses from both sides to get involved with each other. Investments, I believe, will drive trade. So we should look for some big ticket investments, which will then lead to enhanced interest from, with the right partnership and specific working groups, which can actually carry it out intersessional work, and then come up with some recommendations, some practical recommendations, which the business forum can take forward through their own mechanisms. So I believe there's no substitute for specific sector related interactions, because if we just talk of in generalities, then we are not going to get into the concrete business ties. For that to happen, you must have people who are from the same line of business to talk to each other, because they understand each other's language properly. So that specific sector delegations, which used to happen earlier, cannot happen during the pandemic time, because we are looking at a different era at the moment. So why not use this for preparatory work and follow it up later when times are better for physical contact? So that is my view. Also, there is a recommendation in the report for an innovation fund, which is going to help the startups, and a humanities and social sciences collaboration fund, which is like the science and technology fund, which has helped in the in so far. It's been very successful, in my view. Now, startups actually provide us with a very good opportunity of collaboration. Once we get this process going and off the ground in a very solid way, we can expect businesses to carry this forward in future. It will be self-generating. Not recommended a very extraordinary amount. It's only $10 million by each side over 5 years for each of these funds. But this is the seed money, and I believe the two governments should use this and probably take it up at the next summit level meeting between the two to announce these, because it's the sentiment which counts, in my view, not so much how much money we are putting into it initially. Finally, the one more before that, I think we need the direct flights between the two countries, because we don't have that, and whether you like it or not, it's always psychologically better if you have direct flights for increasing trade, investments, and tourism. I think both sides, civil aviation authorities, the airports, etc., should look at it very, very carefully and prepare for that again while we have the time. Once the pandemic eases up, I believe there will be a pent-up demand which will suddenly rise at that point in time, and we should prepare for that during the interim. And then finally, the manpower, strengthening of our consulates and embassy in Australia on the lines of what Australia has done. I'd like to commend Peter for that recommendation, which has actually, in my view, helped a lot, in terms of bilateral relationship and trade and investments going forward. And something similar needs to happen as far as our own consulates, as our own, there used to be an Indian tourism office in Australia, which is also shut down, which needs to be revived. So it's my sincere hope that whatever we are doing by way of implementation happens as soon as possible, that we don't lose time doing that. And I'm glad that the two High Commissioners are here on this platform today. And through them, like to appeal that the two governments take this up very seriously. Thank you very much for your time and patience in listening to me.
Thank you, Anil. Thank you. I think that was a very helpful layout of the actual steps each of us has to take in order to further the recommendations set out in this report. So I'm not going to take too much time. I'm going to hand over to Peter. It looks like from what Anil is saying, there's a number of steps that we can take. The Indian government has certainly made some changes to legislation and policy to assist with, you know, a lot of the investment-related matters in terms of the thresholds that they've dropped or otherwise implemented so that it is an easier flow for business. But I guess we'll hand over to you to see what that looks like on the Australian end. Peter, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Sanushka, and thank you for the opportunity to participate today, and my greetings to my friends on the panel. So Anil's report, which I think is quite a seminal document, had the great advantage of being written when COVID was at least on the horizon, although I think we're still a long way from a post-COVID world, whereas mine had no such advantage, having been finished around the middle of 2018. So I want to begin by really posing the question whether the recommendations in my report and the strategy that it frames still holds up in a COVID and down the track a post-COVID world, because I think we all need to be thinking seriously about just how structurally significant the impacts of COVID is going to be. And I guess my headline answer to that question is a bit the opposite of what the effect of COVID more broadly has been and is likely to be on the world. And that is, COVID has been an accelerator of some deeper trends, whether they're economic or geopolitical. Whereas I think COVID's impact on the India economic strategy, the report that I did, has been not to accelerate anything, but rather to delay them. And I'll come back as to why I think that's the case. So when we were putting together the India economic strategy, we really identified 3 reasons why Australia should invest seriously in India as a priority relationship. And it's worth revisiting those. So the first argument was simply one of scale. Back in 2018, India was the fastest growing large economy and a significant contributor to broader regional and global growth. I think the question of scale still holds, although clearly we are seeing a slowing down of the Indian economy, as indeed we're seeing a slowing down of economies in many parts of the world. India was slowing even before COVID came along, but COVID will be a serious hit. Whether that hit will be of the order of 8%, which I think is about where the Indian government projects it to be, or 10%, which is what the IMF says, or some private sector forecasts, which are much more gloomy. The bottom line is that the impact will be substantial, but I don't think it will change the trend line of the Indian economy continuing to be a large economy growing relatively significantly. The second argument for the India economic strategy was one of complementarity, essentially saying that as India continues to grow its economy, the sorts of things it's going to need, whether manufactured goods or services, are in many cases the sorts of things Australia is well placed to provide. And I think the complementarity argument still holds. I think structurally these are two complementary economies, and I think the scope and the nature of that complementarity will only get sharper rather than recede. And indeed, I think Anil's report has made an even stronger case as to why our two economies are complementary. So I identified 10 sectors where I thought there was a very large measure of complementarity. Anil has identified 12 sectors. Some of them overlap, but taking together, I think it makes the case for complementarity even stronger. And the third reason behind the India economic strategy was spreading risk. And in 2018, that looked like a serious argument. In 2021, I think it looks like a lay down misère argument, given what's happening with the global economy and what's happening with broader geopolitics. And the fact is that India is today high on every country's trade diversification strategy. And so for Australia to be pursuing it for that reason, I think certainly holds. Now, I do want to say something about the other two pillars of the India economic strategy beyond the economic pillar, and see how they're traveling in a COVID environment. So what I said in my report was that you had three pillars to this relationship into the future. You had the economic relationship, on which the IES focused, you had the geopolitical relationship, and you had the people-to-people relationship. Well, I think the geopolitics has moved even more strongly in the direction of a closer partnership. And that's driven, as we foreshadowed in the report, in large measure by the way in which China is positioning itself geopolitically, the way in which it has abandoned hide and bide, the new assertiveness under Xi Jinping, all of the reasons that are causing anxiety in many parts of the world, more recently manifest in what's happening in on the India-China border, manifest in the way in which Australia's own relationship with China is going through a difficult period, and manifest in the way in which US-China relationship has veered a long way from hope for the best engagement, even if it hasn't quite worked out what's going to replace it. So I think the geopolitical arguments have got stronger rather than weaker. The people-to-people story is probably another example of a temporary slowing, but unlikely to shift the trend line. And by temporary slowing, I mean Indian migration to Australia, which has been a key part of the rapid build-up of the Indian diaspora, will slow because all migration to Australia is going to slow over the next year or two. Indian students will not be able to come to Australia at the same rate. I don't expect international students to be coming to Australia in the course of 2021. Conceivably, they might be able to arrive later this year, but I think the more likely prospect is that 2021, like 2020, will see our international borders by and large closed to students. But that said, I still think that the diaspora tie, the people-to-people links, and their role in the business relationship remains a very significant long-term asset for the relationship. So if there's broad continuity in assumptions and in strategy for the IES, that doesn't mean that business as usual is going to get us where we need to get. So let me just say a few things about what we're both going to have to do to get us closer to the goals that are articulated both in my report and in Anil's report. Now, the single biggest impact of COVID, I think, is going to be economic and a dampening of economic growth, and there are other consequences that flow from that. So how to get economies back onto a strong growth path is going to be a challenge for virtually all of us. And whether or not we can succeed in a V-shaped recovery, or whether we're going to face a K-shaped recovery or any other alphabet simile that you might want to choose, the reality is that both of our countries are going to have to pursue a post-COVID strategy of significant economic reform. And we're both going to have to do it against the backdrop of political forces which are working in ways to make it more difficult to pursue the case for open economies with significant trade liberalization. So I think the siren calls of protectionism, the siren calls of self-sufficiency, the deepened skepticism of globalization, the political attraction of supply chains that are not overly dependent on one or two countries, all of those things are going to make the case for an open economy politically harder in most countries in the world, and I'm including Australia and India to different degrees in that. So we're all going to have to learn how to re-prosecute the case for an open economy, because that case is going to be under some sustained questioning. And I think there's no question that when you look at the historical experience of both of our countries, we have done best economically when we have been opening up. That's certainly been the case in Australia. If you plot our more recent economic history from the mid-80s onwards, and it's been the case of India when you plot India's economic trajectory from those significant economic reforms of the 1990s. So addressing the productivity agenda in each of our economies, and they're a different agenda, is going to be very significant. I think trade liberalization is not just a matter of what happens in our bilateral relationship. I think both of our countries will need to keep this high on our national policy priorities. I hope very much, expressing a personal view, that India will not completely shut the door on RCEP. I hope it will at some point take up the invitation to join RCEP. That's entirely a call for India, and India has to make its own assessment of where RCEP fits into its national interests. But from a broader regional perspective, and certainly from a bilateral perspective, an India in RCEP is a much more attractive future than an India outside of RCEP. And I think we both also need to be making as much of an effort as we can jointly and in a larger multilateral context to address the very significant challenges of the WTO, because these are issues which can only ultimately be resolved at a broader global level. So reform of the WTO and making trade liberalization work better is going to be very important. I think there is a risk that we can overinvest in the CECA, in the bilateral free trade agreement. And when I say that, it is not to minimize the potential value of a CECA. I think if we can conclude a free trade agreement bilaterally, that would be a very significant step forward, but we ought not to find ourselves in a situation where it becomes hostage to doing other very useful things in our relationship. And I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that virtually none of the recommendations in either my report or Anil's report, it's a bit qualified, really turn on a concluded free trade agreement. So there's a lot we can do in this relationship, even if we don't have an FTA. Let me just briefly say something about where to from here beyond the macro picture that I've been talking about. It's very important that we don't lose momentum on the implementation of the recommendations in our reports. I think the Australian government has put in place a process for reviewing how we're tracking, for ministers to keep an eye on it, for a subgroup of cabinet to be tasked with implementation. And I think that's a reflection of the seriousness with which the government has taken the report, and I certainly can't complain about any of that. Each of the sectors in my report has a detailed implementation strategy, so I won't go into that, but let me just touch a couple of points amongst the key sectors in my report where additional opportunities have emerged since the report was concluded. On education, we now have an Indian national education policy, which has been announced and released. These don't happen very often. I think it's only the 4th national education policy that India has put out. It does raise the very important question of the internationalization of the Indian education sector and whether or not universities will open up foreign campuses in India. I think it's fair to say that for most foreign universities, and I would count most Australian universities in this, we're going to have to see much more detail about the legislative and other frameworks that would go around what's involved in establishing and operating a foreign university, including provisions relating to the appointment and remuneration of staff and the repatriation of funding from India back to the university's home country. But it does open up, I think, a new area of cooperation that can build on the very significant institution-to-institution relationships that we have. On resources, I think we're heading into a world where renewables are going to have a much higher profile. Climate change is going to be a much more significant international issue. President Biden has already said that it will be essentially the centerpiece of his foreign policy. So I think what we can do together, not just in the traditional resources areas, which both our reports have highlighted, but particularly on renewables, I think is going to be very important. And hydrogen, which I mentioned in my report, will be part of that story. And as you know, some Australian companies like Fortescue are heading down the path of making hydrogen their biggest single focus. And in many ways, the Adani story, which was a coal mining story in Australia and remains so in the imagination of too many Australians, Adani now, I think, with the aspiration to become the world's largest renewable energy provider, is a terrific example of the direction which this resource relationship can go. On agriculture, I agree absolutely with Anil that we need to be focusing on value add, and I think there's more that can and should be done, particularly in the food processing area. And on tourism, which I think is going to be on hold for the COVID period. I can't see our international tourist borders opening up in 2021, but we should be using this time to be positioning ourselves for the post-COVID world, and the single most important thing we can do with our bilateral agenda on tourism is, as Anil says, to get direct air links up and running. Next, I think we both need to make a bigger effort on getting the narrative out to our respective corporate sectors. I still think the Australian corporate sector is hesitant about India. I think the China shock has probably helped a bit in getting them to focus on alternatives, but whether India is seen as a serious and obvious alternative, I think remains an open question. And I think what we have in the combination of these two reports is an opportunity to jointly pitch to our respective corporate sectors. And I think it'd be a good thing if we could do that. And in many ways, Anil, I think your report is a great boost to what we were trying to do with my report. And I hope something similar might work in reverse, because it gives us a joint platform to get this narrative about the future of the economic relationship out. And your report, I think, will focus the Indian system on Australia in a way that an Australian report couldn't, and we should take advantage of that. I think there's more we should be doing on investment promotion, because investment promotion is the really underdeveloped part of this relationship. And as you know, I shot for a target of 10 times investment by 2035. I think it will help leaven some of the perceptions in the corporate sector about India as a highly protectionist country, because I think India's investment liberalization credentials are good and getting stronger. And I think the details of that are not sufficiently known in Australia. And then the last thing I'll say about what we can be doing more together is on that strategic geopolitical agenda, which is going well, going fast, but we have this huge task ahead of us to work through a new strategic equilibrium in the Indo-Pacific, which in my view should both engage and constrain China, and I think India and Australia should be working on it. So let me just end with a couple of observations. We are in a different environment to when the India economic strategy was launched, but I think the core judgments and trend lines still hold true, if somewhat delayed. I still think the judgment that there is no single market anywhere in the world for Australia that offers more growth potential than India holds. I think that if we're to get there, we both need to be pushing out the boundaries of economic reform and making sure that our own economies are as efficient and productive and open as they can. But if we get this right, I think that the three elements of our comprehensive strategic partnership, namely the geopolitics, the economic, and the people-to-people, have every prospect of being realized. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. So it certainly looks like from Peter's perspective that we each have a role to play, and there are aspects of it that are more settled on either end, or have processes in place, or organizations that are already ready to go. But certainly from a corporate perspective, we need some success stories on both sides. And I think particularly for organisations like the Australian India Business Council, the Business Council of Australia, CII, the opportunity is really there for us to make that contribution and to see how we can facilitate that kind of corporate investment. So I guess that gives us a little bit of homework. So thank you, Peter. I'm now going to hand over to Barry so that he can talk to us about what it's like in India now, what we're going to be doing about these reports, and particularly how we're going to be moving this forward in a post-COVID world. Barry, over to you.
Namaskar, firstly, from the Australian High Commission here in New Delhi. Secondly, thank you, Sanushka, for that. And thirdly, I thought I'd do something slightly different to try and ensure that the participants who've phoned in for this can get some time to ask questions. So I just thought I'd add a couple of points. You know, I don't disagree with the team that I call the Simon and Garfunkel of the Indian economic relationship, Peter and Anil, and hopefully that relationship stays together much longer than those two. But you're certainly making beautiful music together. Clearly, as Peter has alluded, in this past 12 months, we've had many things have come together. And one of those things was the two Prime Ministers in their virtual summit, where they concluded a comprehensive strategic partnership, but also 8 agreements across a range of areas that are covered by one, both, or both of the reports put out by Peter and Anil. And as we know, having agreements, having MOUs certainly help move an issue forward, certainly help the dial move forward here. So I think the upside is that we've seen over this past 12 months continued activity at a government-to-government level, agency-to-agency, to try and create the sorts of opportunities that business can seize here. In that sense, you know, business literacy continues to be the thing that I think is critical for the relationship. And whilst I know that is a trope that is used by everybody in every speech around India-Australia economic relationships, I'm not yet convinced that it's been taken as seriously as perhaps it was more than a generation ago, when another Asian country in the north of Asia was being opened up or being examined in the first instance by Australian business and investors, where they went through, you know, from the outset, an incredible exercise in reviewing the new market, in putting resources behind those assessments, and then making decisions as business will on the basis of what they found. I don't see the same consistency or the same resources being put into Indian literacy by the private sector, by universities, by other groups, as I remember happening in relation to that earlier economic transformation with another country. That said, I have to say that I give Austrade a pat on the back. They've updated their model of business engagement to try and firstly deal with the current world in which we're in, but secondly to try and better define how Australian companies can interact with Indian companies. I can say to all those listening that post CSP, there's been enormous activity at both an Indian government and Australian government levels, joint working groups, meetings of officers. Certainly the Australian government is holding all of us here and in agencies affected to account. We have to report in, as Peter's indicated, and I get the sense from talking to Indian bureaucrats here that the same thing is happening as well. So you know, the conditions are there. We just need to see the effort, in particular from those people who aren't us, but those people in business who do the deals, create the wealth, and keep our economies ticking. The good news, I'll simply say very briefly, is that of course during this process we've also seen the Modi government engage in economic reforms. They haven't had the financial heft that Australia happily had. They haven't been able to spend to the extent that Australia has spent, but there are exciting, positive reforms there that have and will continue to make a difference in this country. And I know that a number of those reforms have continued to attract investors. Macquarie Bank, Macquarie Infrastructure is still very confident. The superannuation, Australia's pension funds continue to look towards India and the opportunities that exist there in terms of that transport and other infrastructure needs that are only going to be funded through public-private partnerships in the past. And the only other thing I want to say is that, and I know this has been a cut-down version of what I wanted to say, but I do want to give time for those questions, is that I think the 2 or 3 things that have come out of the past 12 months have been to emphasise the importance of trusted partnerships, and that covers both business as well as countries. It's about diversification of supply chains, but it's also about resilient supply chains. So we all got caught short early in the piece. Australia had no PPE. India had difficulty with active pharmaceutical ingredients. And we've come out of it learning those lessons. And I think that puts Australia and India on the same page when it comes to trusted, reliable partners. And I think that creates the conditions that business and investors should be able to exploit to the advantage of both countries.
Okay, thank you, Barry, and thank you for the reminder. You're doing your job and mine at the moment. So to attendees, please send through your questions to the Q&A box, and we'll try to pick them up as soon as we can. So without any further delay, I'm going to hand over to GITESH for you to take us on to the Indian perspective, and then we'll go to questions.
Thank you, Sanushka, and I'm also inspired by Barry O'Farrell to keep it short and provide time to people to ask questions. But we've had today excellent and incisive presentations by 2 very close friends and close partners of this relationship. And both Ambassador Wadhwa and Ambassador Peter Varghese have presented not only reports over time, but they've also presented their ideas, which are very relevant in today's COVID environment. We're already talking of post-COVID, but it still continues to be COVID kind of situation. I can't forget as an ambassador to Australia that it was only recently that the cricket series concluded between India and Australia, and we're all celebrating that. What would world cricket be without India, Australia playing? And it's one of those things which we take for granted. We don't think about it sufficiently, but it's so complicated that Australian players are playing in India, Indian players come and enjoy cricket here. So David Warner captains my own Hyderabad franchise, Hyderabad Sunrisers. So we celebrate a wonderful series worthy of 2 great friends and great 2 cricketing rivals. So that's the way it is when it comes to our own relationship. In about 10 years from strategic to comprehensive, that is amazing. But again, it's only to be expected because there's so many points of convergence. But like any relationship, both Peter and Anil would testify to this, that not everything can move at the same speed. Things move at various kinds of speeds. And in this, we find the political aspect, the defense aspect, perhaps moving a little faster than business. But this is not to despair, and everything has its time, and in the end, an enduring partnership is based on a business relationship, which is two-way, which is healthy, which is trusting of each other. So I'm quite optimistic. I think one of the first things that I should say that when I came here, I was asked always, well, we already had the Ambassador Varghese report, but I was always asked, when is Ambassador Wadhwa's report coming out? So the first thing is that I should say that that question has been answered. At COVID or no COVID, we have been working. There was a little delay, which may have even caused a little anxiety that is India really thinking about Australia. But I think, in the end, that little extra time provided for some extra thinking on what implications the pandemic might have for our partnership. So I would therefore say that one job has been completed, that we do have 2 sets of very, very good ideas which really complement each other. We are always asked about RCEP and free trade agreements. Well, I think what Ambassador Varghese has said, well, CECA is under negotiation, and it was really a pleasure to see end of the last year, almost on New Year's Eve, new Minister Dan Tehan, he mentioned that India would be a priority as far as arriving at a trade arrangement was concerned, and that hit the newspaper headlines. So for a High Commissioner to see that at the end of a year or the start of a new one, that was an absolute pleasure. So I think we are on the right track, notwithstanding those little kind of unanticipated disruptions. As far as India is concerned, yes, there have been challenges, and but let's also give credit that this government has taken tough decisions. In fact, very, very tough decisions, and you can even see the consequences of that. And usually, what happens is that a government reasonably early in its tenure would tend to take the tough decisions. Sometimes the disruptions, but in the end, like the goods and services tax, which was in the last tenure, and people can argue whether that was the most perfect kind of GST. But once you have the constitutional kind of amendments put in place, which itself is a huge exercise and requires tremendous coordination between the central government and state governments and their respective assemblies and parliament. So once the job is done, fine-tuning can always follow. So I think this government has done something which has really done the very difficult thing. It has also followed up with other reforms. Some of the reforms I won't even talk about because they're all over the news, but they are willing to take those decisions. Sometimes they cause a temporary disruption, but over a period of time, they settle down. I think the value of digitization as far as fintech, these have all, I think, now to be seen. I think what the government did early in its tenure, last tenure, now you're seeing that settling down to some kind of more robust financial arrangements. So that let's look at it as something which will give us more confidence as we move along. It is a business-friendly government, and we like to work with our potential foreign partners. Australia is very high in the list of those countries and those potential partners. As you said, Ambassador Peter Varghese, NEP, certainly Prime Minister has in mind the best Australian institutions coming. Certainly the details are very important, but it's very important to engage with relevant stakeholders, including those who might provide that supporting environment in terms of setting up those infrastructure if you need to be in place there. So even without waiting for that process, it's important to start engaging, start doing those recce's, start doing those little discussions. So it will evolve. Once you have an open mind, it will definitely go down, it will filter down even to the Indian side, that what might be the best way of getting the best Australian institutions in India. As far as global supply chain is concerned, yes, it's right that it's not only about India and Australia. These are all international arrangements which are all in some kind of disarray. But in all this, India has shown that it can be reliable and certainly a strong partner when it comes to setting up a global supply chain which meets the expectations of countries like ours, which are not disruptive, which are not coercive, which can support business. So and even in terms of vaccines, in terms of pharmaceutical products, PPEs, I mean, India has not looked to go it alone, not just for ourselves, but take the global community along with it. So the message for Australia, yes, you mentioned about the Adanis and others. We won't get into that. I mean, there were as many complaints, I thought, from here as sometimes Australians have said about India, investment opportunities. And here I do get all those. But I have one message for all businessmen, that you really have to take the plunge, and you have to be thick-skinned and dive into it. Let's remember that Japanese kept complaining, but they entered the auto sector in 1980s, before India's reforms in 1991. And today, Suzuki India makes more money in India and sells more cars in India than even in Japan and elsewhere. So you can't just wait for everything to set in and then I will come one day. I think one has to be straightforward in this, that you have to be part of the process. And I think we understand each other. We are similar in many ways, our environment, although we sometimes optically, we may be looking a little different, but in the end, I think it's fairly similar systems. At least the foundations are same. So with the arrival of the vaccines, with some optimism in our respective countries and globally, and with years of experience in adjusting to this environment, I am certainly optimistic. And certainly on the basis of the two reports, we need to find ways of continuing the focus and implementing the report. So we are ready to work with you and with the governments of India and Australia to both implement them and supervise their implementation as is possible. Thank you.
Thank you, GITESH. So I think you actually, in addition to your remarks, you answered partially one of the questions that are in our box. So I'm not going to delay and take time away from the questions that we have. I'm going to go straight into the questions, and then I might push to some or all of you depending on the question. We've got about 12 minutes, so let's try to maximize this. The question which you partially answered, GITESH, is also from your namesake, GITESH Agarwal from TIQ. And his question is, effectively, why has there been this hesitation in the corporate sector? Like, what is holding it back? And I think, you partially answered that, but maybe Peter, Anil, or Barry, are there any other views that you have in terms of what's been holding us back from the corporate sector? I agree with GITESH. It's really about, pursuing it and being persistent and appreciating that a business relationship, like any relationship, takes time and effort. But is there something more here? Is there something that we're not appreciating? Maybe Peter, I'll push to you first.
Thanks, Sanushka. Look, a couple of things. One is, I think there is a bit of a once bitten, twice shy view in parts of corporate Australia, companies that have tried to enter the Indian market in the past and are still in therapy as a result, and a lack of understanding of what has changed in India, I think, sits partly behind that. Secondly, I think the corporate sector in Australia has enjoyed good times for quite a long period. And that means that there's been less pressure on the corporate sector to look at new markets, new alternatives, new strategies. Again, I think that's beginning to change because the world around us is forcing us to look for alternatives. So it's probably, a combination of many things.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. Anil, anything you'd like to add?
I would just like to add a little bit to what Peter said. I completely agree with him that it's a combination of factors, but I think it's the situation where big businesses get comfortable with a certain market, and to shift away from there requires some effort, especially when, for Australia, for instance, looking at India is not exactly, a very, very easy market. You've got to have patience in this market. Rewards are big, but, you've got to spend some time and effort to diversify. For India, again, the two myths that I've tried to dispel in our report is that it's a very far away market and it's a small market because of this population size. I think that's completely misplaced, and what we've tried to show in the report is that none of this holds true. If there is a company which is invested in Australia or starts dealing with Australia, then there's enormous scope to scale up. Both in the Australian market as well as if you have a partner from Australia for the Indian market. So that's what we try to do. I think it's a question of educating and also informing, more informing than educating big businesses to look at each other more seriously.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the success stories need to be highlighted more. Like I feel like there is actually business that's happening. Corporates are there, but we're just not talking about it as much, or maybe we don't know enough about what they're actually doing there. And maybe that's what needs to happen a little bit more. Barry, anything you would like to add?
Well, look, just the point you've made, which is there are as many success stories as there are ancient, less successful stories that continue to be retailed around Australia. And, you know, it frustrates me that I occasionally see companies today making the same mistakes companies 10 years ago made. Like, you know, Standard Charter is now owned by others and has done very well in India. And with a bit of perseverance, it could have been still connected to that Australian bank that was originally alongside it. So there's those issues, and I think good luck, Sanushka, in terms of trying to get people to tell the good stories, because I remember when I was on the council that you serve on, that we could never quite find the repository of the success stories. And we now have a list that we're trying to keep here for much the same reason. I think that's the issue that I think could do a lot in Australia.
Yep, I'll take the bait, Barry, and I will see what I can do in my term on the council. So we've got a couple of questions now about the Quad. And so I think we might just lump them together. Hang on, I've just lost it. So it's from Yagika Benual, and she wants to know, what importance does the Quad have from an Australian and policy perspective, but also given its lack of structure, what do India and Australia hope for the future in terms of tackling China's growth in regional and global stature? Yeah, that's a tough one. Who wants to take that? Peter, throw to you first again. Oh, GITESH. GITESH, would you like to go first? I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay. Let me put it this way, that I mean, when we're in government, we tend to look at things somewhat conservatively, and we let things evolve without putting dates and milestones in very, very rigid terms. What we have found that as we have practiced our respective foreign policies in an environment where regional powers and countries in the Indo-Pacific, particularly similar countries like India and Australia, we find there's much in common. So over a period of time, maybe perhaps through trial and error, the way we work in multilateral organizations, we find that there is merit in working together, and perhaps rope in a few other partners as well. So let it evolve. Don't set too kind of rigid timelines or milestones. Even when you mention about China, and I know this is a popular theme, but our situation and conditions are different. We are, a democracy with a land border. You are an island, Australia, which is somewhat, separated. So I think one has to be realistic and understanding that we have our own foreign policies, which we will manage quite well, and we will also be helped with our, friendships with other countries. Australia is very important, but let us give it time. Let us not set artificial deadlines and have expectations in advance.
Sure, thank you, GITESH. Peter, sorry I interrupted you earlier.
No, not at all. Look, the Quad's had its ups and downs. I think it's up at the moment. I think it's likely to stay up for a little while. I think it'll be a while before we see the Quad or the Quad Plus acquire a lot of structure. I mean, this is a long way from an alliance type grouping. It's a long way from a NATO type grouping. But I think what it reflects is a growing level of concern about the ability of countries individually to deal with coercion. And so I think the concept of collective action as a means of managing that is going to get a little bit more traction. So I think it's one of those issues which will bring Australia and India closer together, even if the precise character of an evolving Quad is not clear at the moment.
Thanks, Peter. So I'm going to move on to another question now because I just want to take that before we run out of time. This is a question from Christopher Parker. What sort of incentives could be offered to companies to expand in the current climate? Because at the moment, businesses are quite cautious on taking on debt and risk. But given this is an area, I guess, we've all identified with having the most significant gap, are there incentives, or I'm certain they are, but what kind of incentives could we offer to companies like this? So maybe Barry, we'll start with you. Barry, are you talking, but we can't hear you?
Sorry, Sanushka. Look, you know, I start. You know, there are a range of federal government opportunities, the Export Development Grant Scheme and the like, in certain circumstances. But you know, I come from a philosophical tradition, and I know I'm in a diplomatic position at the present time, that businesses that require subsidies to do business are not going to be in business long term. I agree with Peter that free trade is the future of the world. It's always been the nature of success, as you said, with both countries. And whilst governments can assist with literacy, whilst governments can assist, as I say, in some specific aspects, that's about it. India, of course, has a variety of packages available. So I know you, the High Commissioner supports the Hyderabad cricket team, but I visited Hyderabad, which is the centre of the world's vaccine manufacturing at the present time. I could have bought a block of land there when I did my visit, had my approvals within 2 weeks to set up whatever business I wanted. Now, they're the sorts of things that in a federation like Australia, even in states like Queensland, take a bit longer to happen. So there are non-monetary benefits and incentives, I think, in looking at India to establish businesses in.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Barry. I'm just going to hand to Anil to come in from the Indian perspective, and then I think we'll wrap up questions. So Anil, over to you.
Yes, just to add to that, I think, you know, what has happened, I did mention this in my opening remarks that, you know, the government is very conscious of the fact that it has to bring about basic reforms, which is, you know, business, and land, of course, is included in that. The regulations are all, you know, now being looked at quite strictly. So the other thing which has happened in India is that the states are being ranked in terms of ease of doing business. So there's a certain amount of competition which has come about in their own workings. We've got a long way to go in terms of, you know, getting up there in terms of other countries. But at least the process is on, and the process is moving forward as we speak. So that's a good sign. And I think going forward, we will have more easing of any restrictions there are in terms of conducting business in India and also for investing. I think finance is also readily available. In India, it's not a problem for getting companies to finance themselves.
Yeah, no, and I think that's right, Anil. I mean, look, in my day job, I can certainly see, which is, you know, listing companies on the stock exchange, that India's, you know, gone and put in place these new reforms so that Indian companies are able to list as a primary listing on overseas exchanges. But, you know, Australia is not yet one of the prescribed jurisdictions, so we hope that we will be. But again, on the Australian end, we need to be ready and open to be able to do that. So there's work on both sides. And I think that, you know, we need to keep pushing that along. Like, we, as people in the various sectors, need to keep that momentum going. And now, so you were out of time, so I'm just going to say thank you to each of my fellow panelists. It's been very, very insightful. I've certainly learned a lot. And I'm going to now hand over to Shaun Star, who's going to close for us.
Thank you very much, Sanushka, and a big thank you to all of our speakers. Like Sanushka, I've been scribbling notes throughout this whole session, and it has been very insightful, and quite frankly, you couldn't have a better panel to speak on these issues. The two current High Commissioners from both of our countries and the two framers of the reports that we're talking about, which in reality not only set out a roadmap for both governments on where to go from an economic perspective, but also, as all of our speakers have alluded to, businesses and what sectors, and in fact what states and what areas they can invest in and where they can do business. So I think, you know, we've seen reports about India in Australia over the past few decades, but what makes both of these reports unique is the fact that they both set a very clear roadmap of all different stakeholders in which direction we can go in that respect. So both in terms of government implementation, but also businesses and other stakeholders. And what I think is really important is the signaling of both of these reports coming one after another. And if I can paraphrase you, Peter, when you said that both of these reports give us a joint platform to get the narrative out. And I think that's a really important message, because we've known for some time that the Australia-India relationship has been growing. We have heard, as a number of speakers have alluded to, a number of these success stories growing as well over time. But these reports send a very strong signal to businesses in the current economic climate of where and how they can invest in business in both of the countries. So I think what we've heard today about these reports has been very insightful and very valuable, and I'm sure our participants agree. At one stage, we had almost 90 participants on the webinar today, which was absolutely fantastic. So we thank all of you for joining as well. So thanks to each and every one of our speakers for joining and participating and speaking and providing your insights on the Australia-India economic partnership, and it went far beyond the economic partnership as well. A thank you, of course, to Sanushka for your expert moderating, and to Dr. Misra, Dr. Ashutosh Misra, for your welcome address and your insights at the beginning of this webinar as well. And of course, a big thank you to, I guess, the three partners of the Triveni Dialogue series. That is the AIBC, which Sanushka has spoken about already, the Institute of Australia-India Engagement, headed by Dr. Ashutosh Misra, and the Centre for India-Australia Studies, which is housed in OP Jindal Global University. And now nearly all of our speakers talked about the importance of people-to-people links and the importance of non-government stakeholders engaging and building the relationship. And I think it's dialogues such as these, and institutions such as these, and partnerships and collaborations such as this one, that really emphasize what non-government stakeholders can do in this relationship, and how we can continue to build year on year and into the future in a post-COVID world. Thank you to our media partner, India News. A big thank you to Global Youth, an institution in India which focus on foreign affairs, international relations. In India, there are a number of campuses who have chapters in India, and we have a number of students who are on the webinar with us today. And finally, a big thank you to all of our participants for your involvement. And we look forward to continuing this conversation in the future as well. So that concludes our session, and wish you all well, and thank you again for joining.